Miss Marple read this letter 3 times. Then she laid it aside and sat frowning slightly while she considered the letter and its implications. The first thought that came to her was that she was left with a surprising lack of definite information. Would there be any further information coming to her from Mr. Broadrib? Almost certainly she felt that there would be no such thing. That would not have fitted in with Mr. Raphael's plan. Yet how on earth could Mr. Raphael expect her to do anything, to take any course of action, in a matter about which she knew nothing? It was intriguing. After a few minutes more consideration, she decided that Mr. Raphael had meant it to be intriguing, and her thoughts went back to him, for the brief time that she had known him. His disability, his bad temper, his flashes of brilliance or occasional humour. He'd enjoy, she thought, teasing people. He had been enjoying, she felt, and this letter made it almost certain, baffling the natural curiosity of Mr. Broadrib. There was nothing in the letter he had written her to give the slightest clue as to what the business was about. It was no help to her whatever. Mr. Raphael, she thought, had very definitely not meant it to be of any help. He had, how could she put it, other ideas. All the same, she could not start out into the blue knowing nothing. This could almost be described as a crossword puzzle with no clues given. There would have to be clues. She would have to know what she was wanted to do, where she was wanted to go, whether she was to solve some problem sitting in her armchair or laying aside her knitting needles in order to concentrate better. Or did Mr. Raphael intend her to take a plane or a boat to the West Indies, or to South America, or to some other specially directed spot? She would either have to find out for herself what she was meant to do, or else she would have to receive definite instructions. He might think she had sufficient ingenuity to guess at things, ask questions to find out that way. But no, she couldn't quite believe that. If he does think that, he's gaga. Was gaga before he died. But she didn't think Mr. Raphael would have been gaga. I shall receive instructions. But what instructions and when? It was only then that it occurred to her suddenly that without noticing it, she had definitely accepted the mandate. She spoke aloud again, addressing the atmosphere. I believe in eternal life, and I don't know exactly where you are, Mr. Raphael, but I have no doubt that you are somewhere, and I will do my best to fulfil your wishes. It was 3 days later when Miss Marple wrote to Mr. Broadrib. It was a very short letter, keeping strictly to the point. Dear Mr. Broadrib, I have considered the suggestion you made to me, and I am letting you know that I have decided to accept the proposal made to me by the late Mr. Raphael. I shall do my best to comply with his wishes, though I am not at all assured of success. Indeed, I hardly see how it is possible for me to be successful. I have been given no direct instructions in his letter, and have not been, I think the term is, briefed, not in any way. If you have any further communication you are holding for me which sets out definite instructions, I should be glad if you will send it to me. But I imagine that as you have not done so, it is not the case. I presume that Mr. Raphael was of sound mind and disposition when he died. I think I am justified in asking if there has been recently in his life any criminal affair in which he might possibly have been interested, either in the course of his business or in his personal relations. Has he ever expressed to you any anger or dissatisfaction with some notable miscarriage of justice about which he felt strongly? If so, I think I should be justified in asking you to let me know about it. Or has any relation or connection of his suffered some hardship, lately been the victim of some unjust dealing, or what might be considered as such? I am sure you will understand my reasons for asking these things. Indeed, Mr. Raphael himself may have expected me to do so. Mr. Broadrib showed this to Mr. Schuster, who leaned back in his chair and whistled.
She's going to take it on, is she? Sporting old bean. Ha ha! I suppose she knows something of what it's all about, does she?
Apparently not.
I wish we did. He was an old cuss.
A difficult man, certainly.
I haven't got the least idea. Have you, Mr. Broadrib?
No, I have not, Mr. Schuster.
He did not want me to have, I suppose. Well, he's made things a lot more difficult by doing that. I don't see the least chance that some old pussy from the country can interpret a dead man's brain and know what fantasy was plaguing him. You don't think he was leading her up a garden path, do you? Having her on? Some sort of joke, you know? Perhaps he thinks that she thinks she's the cat's whiskers at solving village problems, and he's going to teach her a sharp lesson.
No, I don't quite think that. Raphael was not that type of man.
He was a mischievous devil sometimes.
Yes, but not... I think he was serious over this. Something was worrying him. In fact, I'm quite sure something was worrying him.
And he didn't tell you what it was or give you the least idea?
No, he didn't. Then how the devil can he expect? He can't really have expected anything to come of this. I mean, how is she going to set about it? As I say, a practical joke. £20,000 is a lot of money.
Yes, but he knows she can't do it.
No, he would not have been as unsporting as that. He must think she's got a chance of doing or finding out whatever it is.
And what do we do?
Wait. Wait and see what happens next. After all, there has to be some development.
Got some sealed orders somewhere, have you?
My dear Mr. Schuster, Mr. Raphael had implicit trust in my discretion and my ethical conduct as a lawyer. Those sealed instructions to be opened only under certain circumstances, none of which has yet arisen.
And never will.
That ended the subject. Mr. Broadrip and Mr. Schuster were lucky in so much as they had a full professional life to lead. Miss Marple was not so fortunate. She knitted and reflected. She went for little walks, occasionally remonstrated with by Cherry for doing so. "You know what the doctor said. You weren't to take too much exercise. I walk very slowly, and I am not doing anything. I mean, not digging or weeding. I just, put one foot in front of the other and wonder about things." "What things?" "I wish I knew. Do bring me an extra scarf, dear. There's a chilly wind." "What's fidgeting her? That's what I would like to know," Cherry said to her husband as she set before him a Chinese plate of rice and a concoction of kidneys. "Chinese dinner."
"Ah,
you get a better cook every day." "I'm worried about her, though. I mean, I'm worried because she's worried. She had a letter. It stirred her up."
"What she needs is to sit quiet. Sit quiet. Take it easy. Get herself some new books from the library. Get a friend or two to come and see her."
"She's thinking out something, some sort of plan. Thinking out how to tackle something. That's how I look at it." She broke off the conversation at this stage and took in the coffee tray and put it down by Miss Marple's side. "Do you know a woman who lives in a new house somewhere here called Mrs. Hastings? And someone called Miss Bartlett, I think it is, who lives with her?" "Oh, now, do you mean the house that's been all done up and repainted at the end of the village? The people there haven't been there very long, but I don't know what their names are. Why do you want to know? They're not very interesting. At least, I shouldn't have said they were. Are they related?" "No, just friends, I think." "I wonder why." "You wonder why what?" "Nothing. Oh, clear my little hand desk, will you, and give me my pen and notepaper. I'm going to write a letter." "Who to?" "To a clergyman's sister. His name is Canon Prescott. Now, that's the one you met abroad, isn't it? In the West Indies. You showed me the photograph in your album." "Yes." "Oh, you're not feeling bad, are you? Wanting to write to a clergyman and all that?" "I'm feeling extremely well, and I'm anxious to get busy on something. It's just possible Miss Prescott might help." "Dear Miss Prescott, I hope you have not forgotten me. I met you and your brother in the West Indies, if you remember, at St. Honore. I hope the dear Canon is well, and did not suffer much with his asthma in the cold weather last winter. I am writing to ask you if you can possibly let me have the address of Mrs. Walters, Esther Walters, whom you may remember from the Caribbean days. She was a secretary to Mr. Raphael. She did give me her address at the time, but unfortunately I've mislaid it. I was anxious to write to her, as I have some horticultural information which she asked me about, but which I was not able to tell her at the time. I heard in a roundabout way the other day that she'd married again, but I don't think my informant was very certain of those facts. Perhaps you know more about her than I do. I hope this is not troubling you too much. With kind regards to your brother, and best wishes to yourself. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple.
Miss Marple felt better when she dispatched this missive.
At least I'm doing something. Not that I hope much from it, but it might help.
Miss Prescott answered the letter almost by return of post. She was a most efficient woman. She wrote a pleasant letter, and enclosed the address in question.
I've not heard anything directly about Esther Walters, but like you I heard from a friend that they had seen a notice of her remarriage. Her name now is, I believe, Mrs. Alderson or Anderson. Her address is Winslow Lodge, near Alton, Hants. My brother sends his best wishes to you. It is sad that we live so far apart. We are in the north of England and you south of London. I hope we may meet on some occasion, though, in the future. Yours sincerely, Joan Prescott. Winslow Lodge, Alton. Now, that's not so far from here, really. No, not so far away. I could. Oh, I don't know what would be the best method. Possibly one of Inch's taxis. Slightly extravagant, but if anything results from it, it could be charged at expenses quite legitimately. Now, do I write to her beforehand, or do I leave it to chance? I think it would be better really to leave it to chance. Poor Esther, she could hardly remember me with any affection or kindness.
Miss Marple lost herself in a train of thought that arose from her thoughts. It was quite possible that her actions in the Caribbean had saved Esther Walters from being murdered in the not-far-distant future. At any rate, that was Miss Marple's belief, but probably Esther Walters had not believed any such thing.
A very nice woman. The kind that would so easily marry a bad lot. In fact, the sort of woman that would marry a murderer if she were ever given half a chance. I still consider that I probably saved her life. In fact, I am almost sure of it. But I don't think she would agree with that point of view. She probably dislikes me very much, which makes it more difficult to use her as a source of information. Still, one can but try. It's better than sitting here waiting, and waiting and waiting.
Was Mr. Raphael perhaps making fun of her when he'd written that letter? He was not always a particularly kindly man. He could be very careless of people's feelings.
Anyway,
said Miss Marple, glancing at the clock and deciding she would have an early night in bed,
when one thinks of things just before going to sleep, quite often ideas come. It may work out that way.
Did you sleep well? Asked Sherry as she put down an early morning tea tray on the table at Miss Marple's elbow.
I had a curious dream. Not a nightmare. No, nothing of that kind. I was talking to somebody. Not anybody I know very well, just talking, and then when I looked, I saw it wasn't that person at all that I was talking to. It was somebody else. It was very odd. Bit of a mix-up. It just reminded me of something, or rather someone I once knew. Order Inch for me, will you, to come about 11:30.
Inch was part of Miss Marple's past. Originally the proprietor of a cab, Mr. Inch had died, been succeeded by his son, young Inch, then aged 44. He turned the family business into a garage and acquired 2 aged cars. On his decease, the garage acquired a new owner. There had been, since then, Pip's Cars, James's Taxis, and Arthur's Car Hire. Old inhabitants still spoke of Inch.
"You're not going to London, are you?" "No, I'm not going to London. I shall have lunch perhaps in Hazelmere. Now, what are you up to now?" "Endeavouring to meet someone by accident and make it seem perfectly natural. Not easy, really, but I hope I can manage it."
At 11:30 the taxi waited. Miss Marple instructed Cherry.
"Ring up this number, will you, Cherry? Ask if Mrs. Anderson is at home. If Mrs. Anderson answers, or if she is going to come to the telephone, say a Mr. Broadrib wants to speak to her. You are Mr. Broadrib's secretary. If she's out, find out what time she will be in. And if she is in and I get her, ask what day she could arrange to meet Mr. Broadrib at his office in London next week. When she tells you, make a note of it and ring off. Oh, the things you think of! Why all this? Why do you want me to do it? Memory is a curious thing. Sometimes one remembers a voice, even if one hasn't heard it for over a year. Well, Mrs. What's-her-name won't have heard of mine at any time, will she? No, that is why you are making the call. Cherry fulfilled her instruction. Mrs. Anderson was out shopping, she learned, but would be in for lunch, and all the afternoon. Well, that makes things easier. Is Inch here? Oh, yes. Good morning, Edward. She spoke to the present driver of Arthur's taxis, whose actual name was George. Now, this is where I want you to go. It ought not to take, I think, more than an hour and a half. The expedition set off. Esther Anderson came out of the supermarket and went towards where she had parked her car. Parking grew more difficult every day, she thought. She collided with somebody, an elderly woman limping a little who was walking towards her. She apologized, and the other woman made an exclamation. Why, indeed, surely it's Mrs. Walters, isn't it? Esther Walters? Oh, you don't remember me, I expect. Jane Marple. We met in the hotel at St. Honore. Oh, quite a long time ago. A year and a half. Miss Marple? Oh, yes, so it is, of course. Fancy seeing you. How nice to see you. I'm lunching with some friends near here, but I have to pass back through Alton later. Will you be at home this afternoon? I should so like to have a nice chat with you. It's so nice to see an old friend. Yes, of course. Any time after 3 o'clock. The arrangement was ratified. Old Jane Marple, said Esther Anderson, smiling to herself. Fancy her turning up. I thought she'd died a long time ago. Miss Marple rang the bell of Wimpole Lodge at 3:30 precisely. Esther opened the door to her and brought her in. Miss Marple sat down in the chair indicated to her, fluttering a little in the restless manner that she adopted when slightly flustered, or at any rate when she was seeming to be slightly flustered. In this case it was misleading, since things had happened exactly as she'd hoped they would happen. It's so nice to see you, so very nice to see you again. You know I think things are so odd in this world. You hope to meet somebody again, and you're quite sure you will, and then time passes, and then suddenly you do, and it's such a surprise. Yes, indeed. And then one says, it's a small world, doesn't one? Yes, I think there is something in that. I mean, it does seem a very large world, and the West Indies are a very long way away from England. But, of course, I could have met you anywhere, in London, or at Harrods, or a railway station, or in a bus. There are so many possibilities. Yes, there are a lot of possibilities. I certainly shouldn't have expected to meet you just here and now. This isn't really your part of the world, is it? No, it is not. And not that you're really so very far from St. Mary Mead, where I live. Actually, I think it's only about 25 miles. 25 miles in the country, though, when one hasn't got a car, and of course I can't afford a car. Well, anyway, I can't drive. There wouldn't be much point. No, one really does only see one's neighbours on the bus route, or go by taxi from the village. You're looking wonderfully well, Miss Marple. Oh, I was just going to say you were looking wonderfully well, my dear. I had no idea you lived in this part of the world. I've only done so a short time, since my marriage, actually. Oh, I didn't know. How interesting. I suppose I must have missed it, but I do always look down the marriages. I've been married 4 or 5 months now. My name is Anderson now. Mrs. Anderson. Yes. Well, I must try and remember that. And your husband? It would be unnatural, she thought, if she did not ask about the husband. Old maids were notoriously inquisitive. He's an engineer. He runs the time and motion branch. He's a little younger than I am. Well, that's much better. So much better, my dear. These days men age so much quicker than women. I know it used not to be said, but it's true. What I mean is, they get more things the matter with them. I think they worry and work too much. When they get high blood pressure, or low blood pressure, or sometimes a little heart trouble. They're rather prone to gastric ulcers too. I don't think we worry so much, you know. I think we're a tougher sex. Yes, well, perhaps we are. She smiled now at Miss Marple, and Miss Marple felt reassured. The last time she'd seen Esther, Esther had looked as though she hated her, and probably she had hated her at that moment. But now, well, now, perhaps, she might even feel slightly grateful. She might have realized that she herself might have been under a stone slab in a respectable churchyard, instead of living a presumably happy life with Mr. Anderson. You look very well, and very gay. So do you, Miss Marple. Well, of course, I'm rather older now. One has so many ailments. I mean, not desperate ones, nothing of that kind, but one's always got rheumatism or some kind of ache and pain somewhere. One's feet are not what one would like feet to be, and there's usually one's back or a shoulder or painful hands. Oh, dear, one shouldn't talk about these things. What a very nice house you have. Yes, we haven't been in it very long. We moved in about 4 months ago. Miss Marple looked round. She'd rather thought that was the case. She thought, too, that when they had moved in, they had moved on quite a handsome scale. The furniture was expensive and comfortable to just this side of luxury. Good curtains, good covers. No particular artistic taste displayed, but she would not have expected that. She thought she knew the reason, too, for this appearance of prosperity. She thought it came about on the strength of the late Mr. Raphael's handsome legacy to Esther. She was glad to think that Mr. Raphael had not changed his mind on that. I expect you saw the notice of Mr. Raphael's death. Oh, yes, indeed I did. A month ago now, wasn't it? I was so sorry. I was rather distressed, really, although I suppose one knew. I mean, he almost admitted it, didn't he? He hinted several times that it wouldn't be very long. I think he was quite a brave man about it. Don't you? Yes, he was a very brave man, and a very kind one, really. He told me, you know, when I first started to work for him, that he was going to give me a very good salary, but that I would have to save out of it, because I needn't expect anything else from him. And I certainly didn't. He was very much a man of his word, but apparently he changed his mind. Yes, well, I am very glad of that. I thought, perhaps, not that he of course said anything, but I wondered. He left me a very big legacy, a surprisingly large sum of money. It came as a very great surprise. I could hardly believe it at first. I expect he wanted it to be a surprise for you. He was perhaps that kind of man. Did he leave anything to, what was his name, the attendant, the nurse attendant? Oh, you mean Jackson. No, he didn't leave him anything. I believe he gave him some handsome presents, though, in the last year. Have you seen anything more of Jackson? No. I don't think I've met him once since that time in the islands. He didn't stay with Mr. Raphael after they got back to England. I think he went to Lord somebody or other who lives in Jersey or Guernsey. I would like to have seen Mr. Raphael again. It seems odd after all we were mixed up in. He and you and I and some others. And then later, when I'd come home, when 6 months had passed, it occurred to me one day how closely associated we had all been in our time of stress, and yet how little I really knew about Mr. Raphael. I was thinking it only the other day, after I'd seen the notice of his death. I wish I could know a little more. Where he was born, you know, and his parents, what they were like, whether he had any children, or nephews, or cousins, or any family. I would so like to know. Esther Anderson smiled slightly. She looked at Miss Marple, and her expression seemed to say, Yes, I'm sure you always want to know everything of that kind, about everyone you meet. But she merely said, No, there was really only one thing that everybody knew about him. But he was very rich. That's what you mean, isn't it? When you know someone's very rich somehow, you don't ask any more. I mean, you don't ask to know any more. You just say he's very rich, or he is enormously rich. And your voice goes down a little because it's so impressive, isn't it, when you meet someone who is immensely rich. He wasn't married, was he? He never mentioned a wife. He lost his wife many years ago, quite soon after they were married, I believe. I think she was much younger than he. I think she died of cancer. It's very sad. Had he children? Oh, yes, 2 daughters and a son. One daughter is married and lives in America. The other daughter died young, I believe. I met the American one once. She wasn't at all like her father. Rather a quiet, depressed-looking young woman. Mr. Raphael never spoke about the son. I rather think there's some trouble there. A scandal or something, you know. I believe he died some years ago. Anyway, his father never mentioned him. Oh, dear, that was very sad. I think it happened quite a long time ago. I believe he took off for somewhere or other abroad and didn't come back. Died out there, wherever it was. Was Mr. Raphael very upset about it? One wouldn't know with him. He was the kind of man who would always decide to cut his losses. If his son turned out to be unsatisfactory, a burden rather than a blessing, I think he'd just shrug the whole thing off. He'd do what was necessary, perhaps, in the way of sending money for support, but never thinking of him again. One wonders he never spoke of him or said anything. If you remember, he was a man who never said anything much about personal feelings or his own life. No, of course not. But I thought perhaps you, well, being his secretary for so many years, that he might have confided any troubles to you. He was not a man for confiding troubles. If he had any, which I rather doubt, he would keep them to himself. He was wedded to his business, one might say. He was father to his business, and his business was the only kind of son or daughter that mattered, I think. He enjoyed it all, you know, the investment, making money, business coups. Call no man happy until he is dead, murmured Miss Marple, repeating words in the manner of one pronouncing them as a kind of slogan, which indeed they appeared to be these days, or so she would have said. So there was nothing especially worrying him before his death? Well, no. Why should you think so? Well, I don't actually think so. I've just wondered, because things do worry people more when they are, well, I won't say getting old, because he wasn't really old, but I mean things worry you more when you're laid up and can't do as much as you did. Then worries just come into your mind and make themselves felt. Yes, well, I know what you mean, but I don't think Mr. Raphael was like that. Anyway, I ceased being his secretary some time ago, 2 or 3 months after I met Edmund. Ah, yes, your husband. Mr. Raphael must have been very upset at losing you. Oh, I don't think so. He was not the sort who would be upset about that sort of thing. He would immediately get another secretary, which he did, and then if she didn't suit him, he'd get rid of her with a kindly golden handshake and get somebody else, until he found someone who suited him. He was an intensely sensible man, always. Yes, I see. Though he could lose his temper very easily. Oh, he enjoyed losing his temper. It made a bit of drama for him, I think. Drama? Do you think... I have often wondered. Do you think Mr. Raphael had any particular interest in criminology? The study of it, I mean. Well, I don't know, but you mean because of what happened in the Caribbean? Esther's voice became suddenly hard. Miss Marple felt doubtful of going on, and yet she must somehow or other try and get a little helpful knowledge. Oh, no, not because of that. Afterwards, perhaps, he might have wondered about the psychology of these things, or got interested in the cases where justice had not been administered properly, or, oh, well... Why should he take the least interest in anything of that kind? And do not let's talk about that horrible business in St. Honore. Oh, no. Oh, I think you're quite right. I'm sure I'm very sorry. I was just thinking of some of the things Mr. Raphael said sometimes. Queer turns of phrase sometimes. I just wondered if he had any theories, you know, about the causes of crime. His interests were always entirely financial. A really clever swindle of a criminal kind might have interested him, but nothing else. She was looking coldly still at Miss Marple. "I'm sorry I shouldn't have talked about that distressing matter. They are fortunately in the past. I must be getting on my way. I've got a train to catch. I shall only just have time. Oh dear, what did I do with my bag? Oh, yes, here it is." She collected her bag, umbrella, and a few other things, fussing away until her tension had slightly abated. As she went out of the door, she turned to Esther, who was urging her to stay and have a cup of tea. "No, thank you, my dear. I'm so short of time. I'm very pleased to have seen you again, though. I do offer my very best congratulations and hopes for a very happy life. I don't suppose you'll be taking up any post again now, will you?" "Oh, some people do. They find it interesting, they say. They get bored when they have nothing to do. But I shall rather enjoy living a life of leisure. I shall enjoy my legacy, too. It was very kind of him, and I think he would want me to enjoy it, even if I spent it in what he'd think of, perhaps, as a rather silly female way. Expensive clothes, a new hairdo and all that. He'd have thought that sort of thing very silly. I was fond of him, you know. Yes, I was quite fond of him. I think it was because he was sort of a challenge to me. He was difficult to get on with, and therefore I enjoyed managing it. And managing him, well, not quite managing him, but perhaps a little more than he knew I was." Miss Marple trotted away down the road. She looked back once and waved her hand. Esther Anderson was still standing on the doorstep, and she waved back cheerfully. "I thought this might have something to do with her, or something she knew about. But I was wrong. No, I do not think she is concerned in this business in any way, whatever it is. Oh dear, I feel Mr. Raphael expected me to be much cleverer than I am being. I think he expected me to put things together. But what things? And what do I do next, I wonder?" She had to think over things very carefully. This business had been, as it were, left to her to refuse, to accept, to understand what it was all about, or to not understand anything, but to go forward and hope that some kind of guidance might be given her. Occasionally she closed her eyes and tried to picture Mr. Raphael's face, sitting in the garden of the hotel in the West Indies in his tropical suit, his bad-tempered corrugated face, his flashes of occasional humour. What she really wanted to know was what had been in his mind when he worked up this scheme, when he set out to bring it about, to lure her into accepting it, to persuade her to accept it, to, well, perhaps one should say, to bully her into accepting it. A third was much the more likely, knowing Mr. Raphael. And yet, take it that he had wanted something done, and he had chosen her, settled upon her to do it. Why? Because she'd suddenly come into his mind? But why should she have suddenly come into his mind? She thought back to Mr. Raphael and the things that had occurred. Had perhaps the problem he had been considering at the time of his death sent his mind back to that visit of the West Indies? Was it in some way connected with someone who had been there, who had taken part or been an onlooker there? And was that what had put Miss Marple into his mind? She was an elderly, rather scatty, quite ordinary person, physically not very strong, mentally not nearly as alert as she used to be. What had been her special qualifications, if any? She couldn't think of any. Could it possibly have been a bit of fun on Mr. Raphael's part? Even if Mr. Raphael had been on the point of death, he might have wanted some kind of joke that suited his peculiar sense of humour. She could not deny that Mr. Raphael could quite possibly wish to have a joke, even on his deathbed. Some ironical humour of his might be satisfied. I must have some qualification for something. After all, since Mr. Raphael was no longer in this world, he could not enjoy his joke first-hand. So what qualifications had she got? What qualities had she that could be useful to anyone for anything? She considered herself with the proper humility. She was inquisitive. She asked questions. She was the sort of age and type that would be expected to ask questions. That was one point, a possible point. You could send a private detective round to ask questions, or some psychological investigator. but it was true that you could much more easily send an elderly lady with a habit of snooping and being inquisitive, of talking too much, of wanting to find out about things, and it would seem perfectly natural. An old pussy. Yes, I can quite see I'm recognizable as an old pussy. There are so many old pussies, and they're all so much alike. And of course, yes, I am very ordinary, an ordinary, rather scatty old lady. And that, of course, is very good camouflage. Dear me, I wonder if I'm thinking on the right lines. I do sometimes know what people are like. I mean, I know what people are like because they remind me of certain other people I have known. So I know some of their faults and some of their virtues. I know what kind of people they are. There's that. She thought again of the Hotel of the Golden Palm. She'd made one attempt to inquire into the possibilities of a link by her visit to Esther Walters. That had been definitely non-productive, Miss Marple decided. There didn't seem any further link leading from there. Nothing that would tie up with his request that Miss Marple should busy herself with something, the nature of which she still had no idea. "Dear me, what a tiresome man you are, Mr. Raphael!" Later, however, as she climbed into bed and applied her cosy hot water bottle to the most painful portion of her rheumatic back, she spoke again, in what might be taken as a semi-apology. "I've done the best I could." She spoke aloud, with the air of addressing one who might easily be in the room. It is true that he might be anywhere, but even then there might be some telepathic or telephonic communication, and if so, she was going to speak definitely and to the point. "I've done all I could, the best according to my limitations, and I must now leave it up to you." With that, she settled herself more comfortably, stretched out a hand, switched off the electric light, and went to sleep.